Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host and friend, Brantley Smith, former member of International House of Prayer. And together, we are detangling IHOP KC and the New Apostolic Reformation. So Brantley, this is our, I guess you'd call it our kickoff episode. We've I had you on to tell your story, and then had you a second time because we had some topics of interest, and you used the word detangling, and I thought, and I'll for the audience, I'll embarrass myself and say I won't even tell you the amount of time I spent trying to distinguish the definition of detangling versus untangling and see which word was better. But anyway, I thought it'd be
feel any better. I landed on detangling instead of deconstruction because anytime I used the deconstruction word, I all of a sudden became prime target in the sites.
Yeah, it's funny whenever I use the word deconstruction or, there's dechurchification. Anytime I use one of these words, I get all kinds of hate mail and hate comments. But anyway, I thought it'd be a good idea if we tried to detangle IHOP KC. And I know it's a movement that's still going, so it's not like we're coming in after the fact, but there are a lot of people who are escaping. And I thought it might be helpful if we focus on what it was, how it came to be, and all of that. But more than that, it really was the framework that helped develop and shape the New Apostolic Reformation as it exists today. And there are other events like the one that we'll bring up today that, it's so similar. You can't say that it's directly related, but it's so similar you have to take a step back and try to detangle the mingling of the two scenario situations and try to understand what's happening. So anyway, welcome as co-host, man.
Thanks, John. Thanks. No, this has been really fun. First two episodes were fun. And I've been getting a lot of great feedback on it too. And that's my hope that not just with people who are still in IHOP KC might stumble upon this at some point as a resource, but also those who are out of the community. I hear all the time when people get out that they just, for 10 years, they just put everything on hold. They didn't address spirituality. They didn't address what they experienced at IHOP KC. And so to discuss some of my journey, my experiences, what I've observed over the past, decade or so. I think that it's helpful for people. I think to hear language given to it and to hear things named. And so I hope that we can do a lot of that for people and that people are able to detangle.
Absolutely. It's funny. One of the things that I have found that help people escape the most, and this is not just with IHOP KC or with the Branham message, but literally every cult in existence. If you take a person who is not the central figure and just restate what the central figure is saying or what the doctrine is or what their message, what they're standing for, just simply restate it in the same way that they advertise it. People are like, oh my gosh, this is crazy stuff, man. Get me out of here. Yeah. And the cults start attacking you when you restate the things that they're saying. That's the irony of all of this. They think you're just, you're slamming them, you're mocking them, whatever. But if you just simply tell people what it is they're supposed to believe, they scratch their heads and think, wait a minute, am I really supposed to believe that?
It saw so much of it, and I think that's why I wanted to have the conversation that we're going to have today. Saw so much of it, not only personally during the IHOP KC scandal crisis that happened last year with the CYA behavior that happened. There was a real iconic moment for all of us that's imprinted on our heads the day that the allegations were brought to the community there. Against Mike Bickle last year. and they were very vague in what they said. They said that there had been allegations. I can't recall at this point even if they said that they were sexual, but there were allegations of misconduct. And one of the former leaders stood up, and he used profanity. And I don't know if you allow that, but he pretty much stood up and said that it's righteous BS, is what he said right there in the middle of the whole church, that's well-intended righteous BS. And I think that moment right there was a catalytic moment for a lot of people, because we saw somebody else that we esteemed in that movement sit there and call their bluff on it and tell us that there was more going on than what they were letting on. And I think that allows people to see through the fog.
Yeah. We don't allow the term BS on this show. Instead, I try to use the phrase NAR prophecy, because really both are the same.
Looks like it, smells like it, it might be it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's, when you take a step back from all of this, I did an episode with Charles. I don't know if it'll air before or after this, but we were talking about the deliverance ministries, and I got my hands on a handbook of training of said deliverance ministers, and oh my gosh, man, the stuff in there. If you're not wrapped up in it, if your head's not indoctrinated, and you look at this, you're like, this is some crazy stuff, man. This is like one step away from Dungeons and Dragons for adults.
IHOP never got too weird with the naming of spirits and things like that happen in some charismatic circles, but it really does. It starts feeling more like LARPing than it does anything helpful.
Yeah. So there's so many things that we could talk about on this series. So I'm going to call it Detangling IHOP KC. And, if you are a member of IHOP KC and you were indoctrinated in this and you want us to talk about something, there's a specific topic, just send it to us. You can email me. Actually, you can go to the website, william-branham.org, and click on the contact button and just send me a message, and I will add it to our list of things that we can talk about. But today there are things that we have to be careful because we need to do it tastefully. But today I want to say it was last week, there was a big event that happened in charismatic Christianity that there are some links back to the Branhamism and some links to IHOP KC that I'll let you introduce it, Brantley, but the topic is significant.
So approximately about a week ago, Chris Reed, all of this started when Chris Reed resigned from Morningstar Ministries in Fort Mill, South Carolina, pretty abruptly. I don't think that a lot of us had seen that coming, had heard rumors, but IHOP KC people are very familiar with Chris because he was the one who came in and spoke to the congregation immediately after Mike Bickle's allegations went public. He was actually with Mike when the allegations went public, whenever Sam Storms and Francis Chan were turned away when they showed up at Mike's house to confront him. So Chris became a prominent figure in that whole debacle. His message was not to look back, but to only look forward, that there's greater things in front of you than that lie behind you, which is a way of damage control, image management. Hey, this terrible thing that Mike did, let's move on, let's forget it. He told people that they don't want to be like Lot's wife and look backwards and turn into a pillar of salt. And so that was the former IHOP members who hadn't been around recently, that was our introduction to Chris Reed. And Chris, from my understanding, took over Morningstar, or came to Morningstar in 21, and with the intentions of him becoming the president and CEO of Morningstar Ministries. And so that person up to that point had been Rick Joyner, and Rick has ties to the Kansas City Prophets. So he was one of the guys that ran around with them. The ones that we talk about frequently are Bob Jones and Paul Cain, who were the two prominent figureheads. But Rick Joyner was a part of that crew as well. One of the things always struck me odd that really isn't anything of substance, but is that in the 5 years I was at IHOP, John, Rick Joyner, I think I saw him one time pop up there. So there wasn't a whole lot of direct cross-pollination like there was with Bethel Church in California and other houses of prayer, and where we had a whole lot more overlap. But Chris Reed also, I think, is significant. Have you seen the video of Paul Cain praying for Chris Reed?
Yeah, I've seen it. It's, and if you understand what's being said, it looks like very much like the passing of a mantle.
I was going to say, I'm curious your thoughts on it, because the one thing that I don't think I've watched the video in its entirety. I think I've seen a clip of it, and how he almost seemed like he might have been taking a shot at you, John. That they were talking about all the lies that had been spread about William Branham and all these things, and that they would only remember the good things. Almost, it seems like what the prayer was, but passing that on to Chris.
Yeah, there's some. I've not talked about it much, and still, I think I'm going to be a little bit reserved. I don't want to show all my cards at the moment, but there was a point in time in which it was about the time that I started to publish the connections between William Branham and the high-ranking officials of the Ku Klux Klan, and I still haven't really gone as deep as I could. There are some things in there that would blow people's minds and blow people's heads, some of which it goes beyond even the Klan. There's a little bit of risk in saying everything, but you've got, in my book, Preacher Behind the White Hoods, I talk about the unusual connections to the Kennedy assassination. Not saying that these guys assassinated Kennedy or anything like this, but you've got, William Branham's mentor is right there in the Oak Cliff subdivision in Dallas, and he's president, I think, of the Oak Cliff White Citizens Council, something like this. He was so well known in Dallas that if you were in Dallas and you're watching the news, you're listening to the radio, you're going to hear his name. This is the mentor of William Branham. And you have people like Gordon Lindsay, the head of CFNI, who is also in the Oak Cliff subdivision. So they had to know each other, and Lindsay is publishing letters from the Imperial Wizard of the Klan in Voice of Healing. So, you have to step back and just scratch your head and think, wait a minute, all these guys knew each other. And anyway, so when I began exposing all of this, I started receiving emails from Paul Cain, and then phone calls, and I've spoken to not just Paul Cain, but people, on his staff. He had this weird harem of men that followed him around. I don't know if you know much about that, but
I've heard that he's surrounded himself with male assistants and different things like that. But
yeah, there's some weirdness there. But anyway, so he contacted me, and I've never said this publicly, but it wasn't long after that people who became significant in the Morningstar organization also were contacting me, and they were asking me questions as though they were truly a person who is seeking help from one of these organizations. And yet here I'm looking at the name and the person, and oh my gosh, this is a ranking member of Morningstar. And as I'm trying to answer questions, the focus was on prophecy, and the questions were specifically about failed prophecy. So they were aware that I was publishing information about William Branham wherein prophecies had failed. And I was explaining that, biblically, a prophet gets one chance, man. It's either right or he's a false prophet. There's no in between. Because if you're making stuff, I almost used a word that I can't use on the show. If you're making stuff up.
I'm bringing it out of you, John.
You're bringing it out of me. If you're making stuff up and people catch you at it, then, you're making stuff up. It's that simple. Yeah. It is really that simple. And one of the examples that I used in this private communication, when I was a kid and I was in this movement, you were taught as this, we didn't use the word manifest sons of God, but that's essentially what it was. We were taught that we could do these things. And so you want to do them. You want to be a prophet. You want to be an apostle. And I thought I was a big a big guy in this, a big prophet, that I would become one. I never saw myself as a prophet, but things would happen that were just a little bit odd. I would have dreams that I had no inside information whatsoever, and then I would go to the event that was in my dream, and suddenly I look around and, oh my gosh, this is my dream, and there's that thing that I saw in my dream. How did I know it was there? That kind of thing happens.
Yep.
Which, all of which is explainable in the psyche of a human mind. But at that time, I thought that I was having, some special spiritual thing because I'm in this movement. And
John Collins.
Prophet John Collins. I never saw myself as that. But then the problem is, whenever one of them was not correct, well, then I have to take a step back. And even back then, I thought, okay, well, this is just a dream. I have nothing spiritual whatsoever. I am not a prophet because I don't even claim this to be true, right? I can't fake this. This is not something. If God is speaking through my mouth, I can't fake that he's speaking through my mouth, or otherwise I'm a fraud, right? So I was trying to explain this to one of the ranking members of Morningstar. If you're saying stuff that you shouldn't say, then you're probably a fraud. And I didn't use that exact phrase, but I worded it nicely to the person, and I said, you can't make stuff up or you're a fraud, in a nice way. And I can't even remember how I said it. But anyway, all of this was happening. So whenever I saw the video of Paul Cain, and he's specifically talking about what you said, I knew he was talking about me, and he was commissioning, it appears he was commissioning Chris to try to get involved. And then you start seeing this whole series of videos of Chris with high-ranking members of the Branham cult, which is really, really odd. And it was at that point I started digging deeper into Paul Cain and came to realize that he never really left Branham's message cult. He was a message cult member until the end of his life. And at that time, I had not even yet started working with Charles. And when I began working with Charles informed me that he was aware that Paul Cain was visiting message churches up until the end of his life. So definitely he was a message cult member even after helping start the Kansas City Prophets, IHOP KC. And so you have to take a step back and think, wait a minute, is IHOP KC message 2.0? Is it Branhamism 2.0? And I thought, well, we've got to get Brantley on here and detangle this.
It's crazy because the prophetic manipulation still happens, and that's a crucial part of what we see with Chris Reed's allegations. That there was so Chris Reed had his resignation letter go public, and the shorthand of that is that he felt like it was time to step away. It seemed like that there was probably some internal disagreements of some sort, but that he was going to continue ministry, and he listed out a laundry list of things, including overseeing a house church network and all these different things that kind of threw up red flags. And after he released his resignation publicly, or actually I think it was leaked publicly, after that was leaked publicly, Rick Joyner responded, and it's since been deleted. And his response was very quick to distance himself from Chris and disapprove of Chris for his actions. He referred to whatever Chris was experiencing as a deceptive spirit. And then he hints around at who I can only figure is probably Bob Jones and Paul Cain, and how he talks about how that a deceptive spirit stole many years. I think he does go, I think he might have, no, he didn't name Cain in that, but he talked about that it robbed him of his ultimate purpose when referring to Cain. And he said that it took 10 years of effective ministry from him as well. I don't know if that was a Freudian slip or because we're not aware of any Rick Joyner moral failings that are public. But he said that it cost him 10 years. So I'm going to take him at his word there. But he quickly deleted that statement, and then we really didn't hear much besides the Roy's Report articles. They have two articles where they got some direct quotes from Chris they released at that time allegations of clergy sexual abuse for Chris. Morningstar is not referring to it as that. There was a woman who was, that the way that they said it, that she was Rick said it Sunday, was that she was not a young woman. She was only a couple years younger than Chris. She was a lady, a woman. He said things like the woman who is supposedly involved. And so those comments like that create distance and make people forget those power balances, those power imbalances that happen of Chris as someone who is a figurehead at Morningstar. And this girl, although she is close in age, is a student and someone who looks up, and there's that power dynamic there. And especially when we see the messages, and we saw that prophecy was used in the same way that we saw it with Mike Bickle as well, allegedly, in that he would prophesy that his wife was going to die to people, and that they were going to become his wife. That was like the golden thread prophecy that's been alleged and been corroborated by a handful of victims, that the same thing was said to them. Chris didn't do anything that out there of promising marriage, but he began to call her special, that she was different, that God had something special for her, that she was more special than the other Morningstar students. And so unless you've been on the receiving end of a conversation like that, of someone that you look up to, that is someone in power and authority, you don't realize how much of a sway that can have on your emotions, how much that can impact. It causes a bonding to happen when you feel like someone is speaking on God's behalf to you. It's a real slippery slope, but it's 100% prophetic manipulation.
Absolutely. And I'm going to speak in general terms. I'm not going to refer specifically to any of the people under these allegations.
Sure.
Allegations are allegations, but the way that Branhamism worked, and we see that this is a replication of Branhamism in many, many different avenues that the New Apostolic Reformation has taken, it creates a hierarchy that is unhealthy, wherein the men are far superior to the women. The women are not seen as equals, even though I've heard sermons where they say, treat her like your equal. She is your equal, and then explain the hierarchy why she is not your equal. It's that bad. And the men and the women don't have the same spiritual status in these things. And so the women want to find and connect to somebody who is superior to them because they've been mentally trained to do this. And whenever a predator sees the opportunity in that setup, it's literally the foundation for predators, they can use that tool as a manipulation to start making them feel more, the word special, again, I'm not referring specifically to people at Morningstar, but you can make them feel special. And then that's the door that opens up. And once that door is open, it can go to really, really far to extremes. And in the Branham cult, I have seen time and again, there are leaders who have fallen to things like this. And the problem is, because the indoctrination has made people believe that the fivefold ministry creates an element of spiritualism over these figureheads where they are above human, whenever they do something like this, whenever they prey on victims, because they're fivefold ministers, it can all be erased simply by saying, oh, I did this thing in the past, and therefore forgive me and put me back in the same exact position so I can do it again. That's where really I have a huge problem with this.
Which is an interesting point that was brought up on Sunday by Rick as well. We have laughed and called him Restoration Rick, me and my friends, because of what seems to be Rick Joyner's specialization in restoring people to ministry. He had a segment on Sunday that was very telling, in that they talked about when they learned about this relationship with this student, this abuse. in my opinion. They referred to it as an inappropriate relationship. They referred to it as a naivety on Chris's part, a stupid decision, lack of wisdom. These are the words they use rather than calling it what it actually was. But it doesn't seem that Chris was really removed from any kind of position of authority for a significant amount of time. Rick talks about how that the church's view of ministry is messed up. And what's deceptive about this is that at first it sounds appealing. At first it sounds righteous until you think about how it plays out. He talks about that ministry is not platforms, power, and position, but ministry is service. It's taking up your cross. It's laying down your life for another. And so in Rick's world, ministry is necessary for restoration. I think he even went as far as saying something along the lines of that, like that public ministry has been a part of every restoration process that he has done. And so like these subtle changing of things and not recognizing the power that is associated with the platform and the influence and the sway, and trying to paint it as some kind of humble servant position when we know that's farthest thing from the truth, what appears to be the truth. It gets real messy real quick because they're able to make these things go away and act like it didn't happen, as you were saying. They've become experts at getting people back in the limelight, and we're all bracing for the day when Mike Bickle attempts it. Luckily, he hasn't yet. The other thing that was brought up that was very interesting, and not really going through this stuff chronologically with the service on Sunday and the stuff that Rick had said. And there was also another video of another former leader who had published a response to all of it. Because at the end of the day, what they're trying to draw attention to is that the sexual component that existed in this abuse between Chris Reed and this student was not conveyed at the initial moment of confession, of whenever this girl first brought it to leaders. So she had talked about the text messages that had happened, but she hadn't talked about any kind of physical components. And so it appears to me that what they're doing now is trying to discredit her and saying that it's not true because she didn't say it then. You wrap in some Matthew 18 with that they use to control things. And Rick talked about specifically on Sunday that when someone faces someone whenever they're accusing and the accuser comes to face the person they're accusing, that stories change. And he's so close to realizing the dynamics there of realizing that a victim should not be facing their abuser in that kind of situation. But they use these tactics, I think, to maintain control, to be able to hopefully shape the way that victims respond and that the way they're perceived by the public. It's that part of it's horrifying. Did you guys have a lot of the Matthew 18 misuse? Because we saw it with IHOP KC. Did you guys have that in the Branham stuff, the Branham cult?
We didn't have any loaded language that was specifically called Matthew 18. I'd probably need to know a little bit more about what specifically in Matthew 18 you're talking about.
That's the passage about if your brother commits a sin against you, you go to him. And so the way that these guys portray it, like with Mike, whenever the Jane Doe came forward and all these different people, when different situations were brought to Mike, the way that he would respond is says that he would want to talk to them alone, face to face.
Got it.
Because that's first step of Matthew 18.
Got it.
So you have someone in that power dynamic who is isolated. There was even an instance with the Mike Bickle situation where a spouse had asked to come along, and Mike refused until he got to meet with them privately first. And so it's all this, the phrase, and even Joyner used it on Sunday. He says that there's a biblical due process. And whenever they say biblical due process, Matthew 18 is what they're looking at. So you need to go by yourself. If they don't hear you, then you bring a witness with you. Rick made sure to clarify on Sunday to the entire congregation that if they were not an eyewitness to events, if they did not see it with their own eyes, that they needed to keep their mouth shut. And then he made some comments that honestly I perceived as veiled threats whenever he said this, because what he said that there is severe consequences for those who slander the people of God. And he begins comparing them to a stumbling block. And he says, the Bible says that if you are a stumbling block, it would be better off that you were not born. And he says these things in succession. And I'm sitting there, and you hear people clapping and you hear people cheering, but I'm like, I don't think you realize what he's saying. He is saying that if you didn't see this, you can't have an opinion. You don't have a say. And when we see people get positions of power and they go unchecked, it's only those voices that provide any kind of accountability. It gets, painted as gossip or whatever, but really it's they're abusing power, and this is what it's come to. Did you guys have situations like that in the Branham cult?
Yeah, we had similar things in the Branham cult. They taking a step back from the Branham cult, just applying it globally to the movement and all of its splinter groups. There is a framework that was created wherein the best way to stop people from escaping the mind control of a cult is to suppress anything critical about the cult. And so, not just with this, but with anything, if you can take a scenario where people are going to suddenly say, hey, man, there's something really bad going on here, you isolate that and you have that discussion often to behind closed doors. They had that not just with the sexual relationships, but also with anybody who questioned the Branham cult. If you're raising questions, they will send the quote-unquote brethren to come and basically verbally bully you into ceasing all questions. But it goes far beyond that. I'm not going to get into details because some of these are legal issues, but whenever it gets into a sexual situation where there is a predator, I have been made aware of situations where that was the strategy that was used. Get them away from the people, verbally abuse them into being quiet if they are a predator, try to verbally abuse them into stopping, but don't go to the proper authorities. And to put it into proper perspective, when we left the Branham cults, there was a situation in one of the churches wherein there was a predator in the midst. And I was a little bit shocked because we had normal church service in this church, and towards the end of the sermon, the pastor says, now I have something that I want to address the congregation after this. And I would like after the service, I'd like for everybody except for that family to stay here in the building. And after that family left, they started talking about, there is a problem here. We have spoken to the person, and I just want you to know that there are situations where you may be at risk. We are dealing with this person, and if it goes beyond this, we're going to go to the authorities. They've been made aware of this, but be careful. And that was how it was addressed in this church. And at the time, it was so shocking to me. I was thinking, oh my gosh, what if I was that family? I would never set foot back in here again. It would embarrass the heck out of me. Right. But after I really processed this, I thought, if I was that person, I should be embarrassed. If I'm, if that situation were to play out, it needs to be properly addressed. And this church actually did address it in a very good way. That's not what happens in the Branham movement or Branham 2.0. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
Do you think in like a situation like that, because I could also see the inverse happening and that they use that as a way to make problems go away at times? Do you think that that's something that had really happened and confirmed? Or,
You know, that thought crossed my mind too. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, you know.
Sure.
Who knows? I didn't I know that there were some other issues that would raise that question, but I can say that it can be used both ways, but in the way that it was done, even if it were to make the problem go away, it does protect the children. And in this particular scenario, it wasn't adults that were at risk, it was children that were at risk.
Children.
And so I'm like, yes, man, that protect our children.
Don't want to play with fire in those situations.
No.
The other component to this Morningstar stuff was actually some abuse that had happened in the context of what they are claiming is an unaffiliated youth program of sorts. And there was an investigation done that was internal, that was performed by, from what they have relayed, by their head of security, who was a former police officer. And there was another little slip whenever they're talking about whenever Rick was talking about this, and said that I guess that he doesn't have a great relationship with the local police department as a former policeman, which makes things very curious. They Rick made sure to affirm that the negligence that they're accused of is that they're in no way negligent, that it's all false, that he did this posturing to try to make himself, I think that this is why people do this. I can't know Rick's motives, but he postured himself in a way that he says, you know, we stand with victims. And he says that our goal, and he points to his lawyer, he talks about their lawyer sitting there, and that his lawyer's of the same mind, that they're not looking at situations from perspective liability, but they're trying to get to the truth. And so in saying that they stand with victims, these victims I guess are suing the church, from what I understand, and some other people associated with it. They say that they're not going to stand against victims. And he even says we're on the same side as the victims. But then says our ultimate goal is the truth. And I think that is the phrase that you want to know what their definition of the truth is and what that means to them. Because as we have seen, you know, there's no collateral damage that stops these kind of things. Like the people are expendable. And from what I've heard, I've not seen anything published directly, so this is just conjecture. But this man who abused these kids apparently was the son of one of the elders at Morningstar, and so you hear that he was not an employee of the church. You hear them say that he was a volunteer, that he didn't have any kind of official position, all these things that are used to distance themselves from this situation. And they act like that they use the right language. And that's why it's so hard to see through it at times, because they say things like, we're going to stand with the victims. They say things like, we have to protect our people, that our people are the most important thing. But I'm not sure when ministries say things like, we got to protect our people, I think sometimes what they're worried about is more about not being able to keep the doors open or not having people have a mass exodus, rather than the actual harm that happens in these situations. He made sure to tell them all they had great insurance. That was a funny aside that he took to say for a minute, and he made some very definitive statements about their insurance, that their insurance agent probably had a panic attack. We're covered for everything. Everybody's covered. And it was all kind of language like that. And it's like, oh, okay, here we go. But this image management, it's an interesting thing.
It is. And for me, it's really this simple. I am sympathetic to people who have mental health issues. And that includes, people who are, again, these are allegations. I'm going to separate myself from talking directly to specific people. But when a person is a predator like this, it's because they have an issue. They have something that they really need counseling for. They need therapy, sometimes medication. And I'm sympathetic to that. And I do believe in a forgiving God that can forgive them. Where I draw the line is that whenever it's a position in leadership where they're placed in a scenario where now a predator is enabled by having prey, that's where this becomes problematic. Because whenever it is proven that this issue exists, it's not like this issue just magically goes away later in life and never again they think about it. They will always think about it. For the rest of their lives, they will think about it because they did this thing. And leadership who, if these people are true leaders and they're leading people, they're aware that for the rest of their lives, this person will face this situation. Kick them out of leadership. This person, yes, they can be forgiven. Yes, they can, if they're no longer praying, they can be in the midst of the crowd listening, but don't put them back into the place where they can do it again. That's really, really problematic. And we see it time and time and time again. And again, not to name specific people, but we have people that, Paul Cain didn't just give his mantle to one person. Paul Cain thought he had this gift that kept giving. And you look at Paul Cain and his problems, and he should have been kicked out of leadership long ago. None of this we would not have this podcast today had Paul Cain just been kicked out of leadership and everybody ignored this quote unquote prophetic thing that he claimed to have.
And in every other area of society, John, like, there are safeguards in place. If you are a sex offender and you're put on a registry, you can't live near a school. Like, there's common sense guidelines in the rest of society that helps keep our children safe. If you're on a sex offender registry, you're not going to be a teacher in a public school. You're not going to be a pediatrician as a sex offender. That's the things that they strip their licenses for. But for Restoration Rick and other people, what they do instead is that they take these people and put them through a quote unquote process that honestly they have no training to do these things. They very much lean on their connection with God speaking to them and the Holy Spirit guiding them. When they need to ask some trained professionals on what to do in these situations. And that's why in the advocacy space, you hear people call for third-party investigations all the time, is because churches don't know how to handle these things. They're not equipped for it. Thankfully now in seminary, there's more and more training around this stuff. But in these movements, how often do you get a seminary trained leader? And so that's a unfrequent thing as well. It astounds me the lack of basic boundaries with these situations that we allow to continue and blindly support. The other public situation, that Rick was involved with was Todd Bentley. And we saw how that went. And these things, you would think that we would learn from our decisions. My favorite cop out that I heard, I think it's a cop out, that's my opinion, of Rick on Sunday, was that he told the people that he apologized for not discerning this behavior with Chris. And what he was most concerned about with Chris is that Chris was being deceptive. It wasn't the abuse. But he said he wasn't able to discern it. And he's like, I prayed for discernment. And he's like, but the mistake I made is I didn't ask the Lord for discernment now. I didn't ask for it now. He's like, the Lord answered my prayer. He gave it to us now. But now I learned I need to ask for it then before it gets to this point. And instead of taking personal responsibility for the situation as the leader of the ministry, instead he says it's God's fault because God didn't tell him in time. And those are the subtle things. And people responded to that, John, with laughter when he said it, as if he was making a joke. But leaders do that to pass the buck, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, and there are personality disorders where you are never at fault, and you're deflecting because you have to deflect. That's mentally how your chemistry is working. That too is a problem. If you're in leadership and there is a problem and you don't accept responsibility, quite frankly, you're not a leader. I mean, it's pure, plain and simple.
Yeah, that's a character tell for me right away. Whenever I'm working with people on teams or anything like that, when they're quick to take responsibility for failures. And it's not big moral things like we're just talking about here, or abusive things, but people who are able to own their junk and admit that they failed and move on. I would rather work with people like that than I would that people who are not self-aware or who won't take responsibility, because there's no growth, there's no moving forward, there's no progress there. It's not safe after a while when someone refuses to, especially when it's situations of harm, when they refuse to address that, they're no longer safe people. But we're seeing with these movements that they're getting it makes me laugh, because I wonder if Rick Joyner 10 years ago heard Rick Joyner speaking today, if he would think that he had gone woke because of the language that they use, that they co-opt. They start using terms that they've not learned themselves, but they've heard other places to try to give an appearance. And so I don't have a whole lot more to say about the situation here, other than the way that they've treated the victim. And I think that they have not made the victim the priority, number one. That everything that we're hearing is about Chris and Chris's future. I'm very suspect that they're trying to get Chris to come back by the language that they're using. Rick made sure to say that he would take him back if he came back. There was techniques used to discredit the victim. They brought up the fact that the purpose of the meeting where the girl confessed, first admitted that the abuse had happened, that it was a meeting where they were trying to determine her future in the school and whether they were going to kick her out or not. And that right there was just all of a sudden a red flag of what they were trying to do. And then there was other things that were said, like her age that I mentioned earlier. And whenever it came to abuse in general, Mike Bickle, I thought, was the king of made-up statistics, but I think Rick topped him on this one. And that Rick made a statement, and it's egregious because it's one of those things that's hard to call out because it's not true, but it still is really bad. And it was that he said that 2/3 to 3/4 of all women have experienced sexual abuse. With a quick Google search, and looking at statistics and stuff, you see that number's closer to 1/3. But the reason that I think that these kind of statements are made is to make it seem like this stuff happens all the time. In which,
unless, of course, the NAR keeps their own book of statistics on leadership, and maybe that's accurate. I don't know.
It might be accurate in an NAR church. It may be. And then he goes on to say the same thing about men. He goes, I think that the number of men is the same because men don't want to talk about it. It was very, very curious. And then he ended up going on a little tirade too of, I think, trying to get ahead of some stories, where he went on a tangent about drinking and alcohol, and how that they're not going to prohibit anyone from drinking alcohol because Jesus drank alcohol, and that they're not going to take any freedom away from someone that the Lord himself had, because apparently in this lawsuit, the drunkenness at Morningstar was one of the accusations, is kind of what he hinted at. And so he went on this big tirade about these man cave gatherings that Rick has, I'm assuming up in Moravian Falls, which that place fascinates me just because I've never known one of these guys to step out of the limelight and hide somewhere in isolation. Like, it's I don't want to get too much into that, but it fascinates me. Moravian Falls fascinates me, and I make jokes about it all the time.
It's also straight out of the playbook from Branhamism. There, I'm not going to name the locations, but similar things exist, and I'll just say it like that.
Was the Moravian connections? Did that happen in Branhamism? I can't even say the word as well, because I know that was a huge thing at IHOP and also Morningstar. Like the whole Morningstar name, I think, came out of like a Moravian publication, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but there are biblical passages, the Bride and Morning Star, so on and so forth, that I think the name was actually taken from. But when you trace its roots all the way back, it goes back into British Israelism. They're trying to apply the names from the Old Testament to the new covenant of Jews. It gets really weird if you try to detangle that. But how those developed, there are probably some internal connections between all of it.
Yeah. I think that if I was going to give some advice to people who are trying to parse through this themselves, who find themselves in similar situations, one, if you're a victim in a situation like this, find a support system, find advocates, find people who can fight on your behalf for you in these situations. If you're someone who's in the pews, I think it would benefit you to assume that everything that is being said could possibly be untrue, to look at it with a hint of skepticism and to weigh it against facts that you see in other places. One of the things that Morningstar announced on Sunday in regards to all this is that all of their, I don't know if they use the word all, but most of their communications regarding these events, the clergy sexual abuse and the lawsuit with the abuse of the young men who were in the youth group, that all of that communication will be through their app only, through the Morningstar app. And so they are trying to control where that information is available and who has eyes on that, who can see that and critique that. A lot of people will try to demonize these outside sources like the Roy's report, because, they do make money off these stories. They do make advertising revenue and things like that when they publish these stories and they get traction. But most of these places, like with Julie Roy's, she was a whistleblower herself who experienced all that happened when she blew the whistle. And so although I think we need to look at everything with a little bit of skepticism, I think that these outside voices that are bringing light to some of these situations are necessary, not to be afraid to listen to these voices, even when your leader demonizes them. If I would have done that simple thing year one at IHOP KC, I probably would have saved myself a whole lot of heartache. I mean, all it took was Googling is IHOP KC occult, and you had pages of search results. And there was even this guy that we all laugh about. None of us actually know him, but some guy in Missouri, know nothing about him, don't know if he's a good character, bad character, had this YouTube channel that we'd all came across. I think it was called Fellowship of the Martyrs, I think is what it was called. And he would post videos all the time about the heresies of Mike Bickle and the Kansas City prophets. And the guy was a bit of character, but if we would have had ears to hear what he was saying in those moments, if we didn't automatically take our leader's word for IHOP is not a cult, when Mike went through his 7 signs of a cult, if we looked at that with skepticism, so much of us, I think, could have been saved from the heartache of being ripped around, controlled, herded like cattle. So much pain could have been avoided. And so I think that's my advice. If you're a victim, find support, find a support structure of sorts, get legal help if you need it. Don't trust these guys in a room by yourself to treat you fairly. And if you're somebody in the pews, look at everything with skepticism, start asking questions, look to other places besides your leaders for information and see if things are adding up. And I think that you'll be able to start seeing through the fog that they're creating.
Absolutely. That's good advice. You know, when you look at a minister and he's preaching to you, a lot of times you want to see the face of Jesus up there, or Paul, or the Apostle Paul, or something like this. Instead, if you look at this person, you say, that looks like Bob from the that I met at the water cooler at work the other day. Bring them back down to your level. It's much easier to critically examine what they say. And you have to realize that whether they claim to be a prophet, apostle, whatever they claim to be, when you realize that they are your equal, they are human and you are human, it's much easier to put the proper critical examination on their speech. And when you do that, often you can head all of this off at the pass. When a person starts, if the guy at the water cooler starts making the women around him feel very quote unquote special, well, you start to realize there's something odd here. Let's be careful. So great advice. I think that's the way it should be. But this is incredibly fun, Brantley, and I look forward to more of these. And thank you for joining us to help co-host and detangle IHOP KC.
Absolutely. Everybody let us know what you want to hear about, what you want to talk about.
Awesome. Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about the dark side of the NAR, read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon Audible.